I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I took the job as a night janitor at Blackwood Memorial Hospital. The pay wasn't great, but the hours were perfect for someone like me, quiet, secluded. No boss breathing down your neck. Just the hum of old fluorescent lights and the occasional scuffle of shoes on linoleum floors. The hospital was a relic, the kind of place where the walls whispered stories you didn't want to hear. It had a history, that much was clear. Some said it was built on land where a small mental institution once stood, a place known for its brutal treatments in the early 1900s. That alone was enough to give it a certain heaviness, a weight that pressed on your chest when you walked through the front doors. I wasn't much for superstition, but there was something about the place that gave me the chills. The corridors were long and narrow, with doors that creaked on their hinges and windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. The kind of place where you could almost hear the past echoing, if you listened hard enough. I was told it would be simple, just make sure the floors were clean, take out the trash, and make sure everything was in order for the day shift. They gave me a set of rules, though, that I was expected to follow without question. Weird rules, things like never go into the old wing after midnight and avoid the basement unless absolutely necessary. The kind of rules that made no sense at first, but as I learned quickly, were meant to be followed. The first night, I didn't think much of them. I was new, tired, and wanted to get the job done as quickly as possible. I cleaned the lobby, wiped down the hallways, and even took the time to sweep up a pile of dust in the storage closet. There was no one around, just the usual hum of machines and the faint smell of disinfectant. But as the hours wore on, I began to feel something that wasn't quite right. It was subtle at first, like a flicker in the corner of your eye. The hospital was eerily quiet, but the silence seemed to press in on me, almost suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off. I was tired, too tired. But as I passed by the old wing on my rounds, I swear I saw something move in the shadow of a doorway. A figure just for a second, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around. Nothing. Only the same empty hallway. It didn't make sense. I told myself it was nothing. I had just been looking for something to distract myself, trying to fill the void that comes with long hours alone. That night, I was in and out of the break room, grabbing a soda and trying to push down the creeping anxiety that seemed to be taking root. I couldn't shake it, though. The hospital was empty, and yet it felt alive, like something was waiting for me. I'd heard stories of places like this, old hospitals, abandoned schools, all haunted by the past, but I wasn't one to believe in that nonsense. Still, I couldn't help but feel it, that sense of unease growing stronger as the night dragged on. I did what I had to do. I finished my rounds, wiped down the floors in the air, and even checked the bathroom that hadn't been cleaned in days. But every time I turned a corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was just a step behind me. Watching, waiting. By the time I finished my shift, it was just past AM, the first hints of dawn creeping in through the windows. I locked the door behind me, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the quiet morning. My car was still parked in the lot, and the world outside seemed so normal, so ordinary. But the hospital, it stayed with me. Even as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me, something that hadn't left. I told myself it was just the fatigue, just the shadows playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was off about that place. And I hadn't even begun to scratch the surface yet. The second night was almost exactly like the first. I had my mop, my cleaning supplies, and my earbuds to block out the silence. I could already feel the routine setting in, the weight of the hours stretching ahead of me like a dark tunnel. I was more tired than I cared to admit, but there was something else too, something different, almost like a low hum in the air. It wasn't a sound you could really hear, but you could feel it in your bones, like a slight tremor just below the surface. The old wing was always the worst part of the night shift. It was located at the far end of the hospital, behind a series of locked doors and rusty gates. The doors were sealed, and the lights didn't work half the time. Staff had long since stopped using it. Some of the rooms had been shut down, while others remained locked for maintenance or renovations, though I hadn't seen anyone working on them in weeks. Rumor had it that the wing had once been used for psychiatric patients, back when the hospital first opened. Old records, old equipment, and the odd broken chair left in the hallway were all that remained of it now. I had been warned about the wing on my first night. Stay out of there, they'd told me. It's been off limits for years. Some things. Best left alone. That was the last thing I wanted to think about as I started my shift. But like clockwork, I found myself walking toward the old wing again. It wasn't that I was curious, not exactly, but more like a magnet pulling me in, drawing me closer despite my better judgment. I couldn't ignore it, couldn't resist the feeling that something was waiting for me on the other side of that gate. Tonight, though, something was different. The door to the old wing was ajar. I don't know how it happened. The door was always locked, and I knew it had been when I'd walked past earlier. But now it was slightly open, just enough to let a sliver of light spill out into the hallway. It was a flickering light, the kind that made you feel uneasy, like it had been on for too long. I stood there for a moment, staring at the gap. I should have turned around, gone back to my rounds. I should have just ignored it, but something inside me, the same pull, the same magnetism, made me step forward. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. It wasn't much, just a few degrees, but it felt cold in a way that crept into your skin, making you shiver without knowing why. The flickering light cast long shadows on the walls, distorting everything in its path. The hallway stretched before me, littered with old, forgotten medical equipment and empty rooms with cracked windows. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I took a few tentative steps forward, the sound of my shoes echoing in the silence. There was no reason to be here, no reason to go deeper into the darkness, but I did anyway. And with every step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more intense. I rounded a corner and found myself facing one of the old rooms. The door was wide open, and inside, it was dark, darker than anything else I'd seen so far. The shadows seemed to shift as I stood there, hesitant, my heart beating faster. I could feel it now, the oppressive weight of something that didn't belong. I couldn't tell if it was the remnants of the place, the memories of the patients who had been locked away for their own good, or something else entirely. I had a sick feeling in my stomach, a feeling that didn't belong in a hospital, but it was there nonetheless. Something moved inside the room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I waited, listening. It could have been anything, just the old building settling right. Maybe a rat, maybe the wind. But I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had moved was deliberate. It wasn't an accident. I stepped back, ready to leave, when I heard it again. A soft shuffle. A cough, barely audible. I didn't want to look, but my body betrayed me. I turned slowly toward the room. Nothing. The room was empty. The darkness was just that darkness. But for a brief second, I thought I saw a figure standing by the window, silhouetted in the dim light. It was gone in an instant, but that single moment was enough to make my heart race. I quickly backed away, my mind screaming at me to get out of there. The door slammed shut behind me, and I jumped. The sound was loud, sharp, and final. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I ran. Back down the hallway, past the locked doors, out of the old wing, and back into the safety of the main part of the hospital. My breath was heavy, my palms sweating as I tried to steady myself. I was shaking now, adrenaline flooding my system. But the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that told me something I hadn't yet realized. The door had been opened for a reason. The third night was the worst so far. I had already been on edge since the old wing incident. That feeling, the one that sticks with you, like a shadow that never quite leaves, was still there, tugging at my chest. But it wasn't just the old wing anymore. It was the whole hospital. Everything seemed wrong. The hum of the lights, the echo of my footsteps, the way the air felt thick, almost like it was trying to smother me. There was one other place I hadn't been yet, the basement. When I first started, they mentioned it in passing. If you need to go down there, make sure you follow the rules, one of the other staff members had said, his voice low, almost a whisper. They don't like it when you wander down there uninvited. Just take care. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't want to. But now, with the old wing's door mysteriously ajar and the unsettling feeling gnawing at me, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The basement was part of the hospital's history, too. It had been built in the early 1900s, and back then, they didn't just treat patients. They experimented, tested things they probably shouldn't have. The walls below the ground were lined with the ghosts of their mistakes, and it was a place that the rest of the staff avoided if they could help it. I was assigned to take out the trash that night. There was a storage room near the elevator on the lower level that needed to be cleaned. The basement. Just a quick trip, in and out. The elevator was old, the kind with the heavy metal doors that you had to slide open. It groaned as it moved, a low, unsettling sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I knew the elevator worked, but it always felt like it was about to break down, like it wasn't supposed to be in use anymore. I pressed the button for the basement, and as the doors closed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air in the elevator was damp, clinging to my skin, and the smell, it was musty, like mildew mixed with something else. Something older, more rotten. When the doors opened, the basement greeted me with a cold draft that sent a shiver through my spine. It was darker than I expected, even though I knew there were lights down here. The fluorescent bulbs flickered sporadically, casting long shadows that stretched and curled like they had a life of their own. I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance, a steady, rhythmic sound that added to the atmosphere of decay. I stepped out of the elevator and turned left toward the storage room. The hallway was lined with old, rusted pipes and wooden doors that had seen better days. Some were open, revealing rooms full of forgotten supplies, while others were sealed tight with thick chains. No one came down here anymore, at least not unless they had to. I reached the storage room, the door slightly ajar. I had to force it open the rest of the way, the hinges creaking loudly as I pushed it past the threshold. Inside, the air was thick, and I could barely see through the haze of dust and stale air. The shelves were lined with boxes, old medical equipment, patient records, things that shouldn't have been down here, things that shouldn't have been hidden away. As I started to gather the trash, I noticed something strange. A box, tucked in the back corner of the room, stood out among the rest. It wasn't labeled, but it looked old, as though it had been left untouched for decades. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it out, lifting it carefully. When I opened it, I felt the temperature drop, just like it had in the old wing. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the box itself was cold, the chill seeping through my gloves. Inside, there were old medical instruments, scalpels, needles, syringes, but there was something else too. A small, yellowed notebook, its pages brittle and fragile. I took it out, turning it over in my hands. It was a diary. Someone's personal notes, written in faded ink. It was the kind of thing that didn't belong in a basement, hidden away in a box. I flipped it open, skimming through the first few pages. The handwriting was erratic, the words rushed, as if the person writing it was struggling to get something down before they ran out of time. I can hear them. One entry read, "Down in the basement. They don't leave me alone anymore. They whisper when I try to sleep." I felt my stomach turn. I quickly closed the book, shoving it back into the box and leaving it there, out of sight. I didn't want to read more. I didn't want to know what kind of history I was uncovering. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Faint at first, just the brush of words against the air. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, but there was no one in the basement with me. The whispering continued, growing louder, clearer. They're here. They're all here. I dropped the trash bags, the sound of them hitting the floor echoing in the silence. I turned to leave, but the air around me seemed to thicken, pulling me in, holding me in place. "Leave now," the voice whispered. "Leave before it's too late." I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care if I left the trash behind. All I wanted was to get out of that basement, away from whatever it was that was calling to me. The elevator door slammed shut behind me, and I hit the button to return to the main floor, pressing myself against the wall, gasping for air. When the doors opened again, I didn't wait. I bolted back into the safety of the first floor, where the lights were bright and the air didn't feel so heavy. I had heard it. The whispering. I knew what it meant. But now, I wasn't sure I could ever leave the hospital. Not after what I'd just uncovered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The basement had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, but it was the kind of feeling that gnawed at you quietly, like a dull ache that wouldn't go away. As much as I tried to put it out of my mind, I couldn't. The whispers still echoed in my head, repeating that warning, "Leave before it's too late." I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, the stress of the job, the weird hours. But deep down, I knew better. I had stumbled onto something down there, something that wasn't meant to be found, something that had been hidden for years. I tried to focus on the night ahead, keep my mind busy. There was always something to clean, something to check on. As I made my rounds, I thought about the whispers, the diary, the unsettling fact that something in the hospital didn't want me there. I was starting to feel like I was being watched all the time, even when I was alone. It was around 3 a.m. when I found it. The hallway on the second floor had always been quiet. It wasn't a busy part of the hospital, so I rarely had to deal with patients or staff, just the way I liked it. I was coming around the corner, pushing my cart loaded with supplies, when I noticed something odd. One of the doors was open. I'd been down this hallway dozens of times, and I knew every door. This one, room 214, was always closed. Always. I had checked it the night before, and the door was locked tight. But now, it was ajar, just a crack. I stopped, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the air shift, the silence pressing in on me. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like it's too quiet, too still, like something is waiting. I stepped forward cautiously, my hand hovering near the door, unsure if I should open it or just walk away. But curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open, just a little more, and peered inside. The room was dark, but the light from the hallway spilled in enough to illuminate the edges of the bed and the dresser against the wall. But there was something off. The bed wasn't empty. It was as if someone was lying under the covers, but there were no blankets, no sheets, just Nothing. Just an empty bed with the covers folded in on themselves, like they'd been there for years. I stepped inside, my breath quickening. My mind raced. It had been empty just hours ago, hadn't it? I looked around, my eyes scanning the room. And that's when I saw it. On the far wall, near the window, there was a door. I knew the room didn't have a second door. It wasn't possible. The hospital had been designed in a simple layout to entrances, no hidden passages, no secret rooms. But there it was, a door I'd never seen before. I took a step toward it, drawn in by the sight of something that didn't belong. My hand was almost on the handle when I froze. I could feel something behind me. Someone. The weight of their presence pressing in on me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the empty room, the soft hum of the lights above. I felt the breath catch in my throat. There was no explanation for this. No logical reason for what I was seeing. Then the door shifted. I didn't imagine it. The wood warped just a little, like the frame was expanding and contracting. My stomach twisted and a deep guttural fear settled into my bones. My mind screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the door, from the way it seemed to change, like it wasn't meant to be there. I backed away slowly, my body moving on its own, my instincts taking over. But just as I turned to leave, the air grew cold. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and I could feel the hairs on my neck stand on end. It wasn't a chill like you feel when a draft hits. No, it was an unnatural cold, a biting cold that sank into your bones. I heard it then, a sound. Low, muffled. A thud, then a scrape, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The sound came from the direction of the door. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. I could hear the dragging sound follow me, almost like footsteps, like something or someone was chasing me. I didn't stop until I reached the stairwell and raced up to the main floor. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow. My legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. But I didn't care. I just had to get away. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. That door, no. Those walls, they weren't right. Nothing in that room was right. I don't know if anyone else had seen it. The nurses, the doctors, they all went about their business, oblivious to the strange things I was witnessing. But I knew. I knew that something was shifting inside that hospital, something dark and hungry, something that didn't want to be found. And it was starting to notice me. The hospital was quieter than usual. It felt like a waiting room for the world to end, but I couldn't pinpoint why. Even the usual hum of the lights, the white noise of the air conditioning, seemed more oppressive tonight. It was as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After the incident with room 214, I was more on edge than usual. My hands were shaking as I wiped down surfaces, as if the act of cleaning could somehow rid me of whatever was hanging in the air. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking just out of view. But there was nothing, just the sterile white walls and the eerie silence. I kept my routine, moving from hallway to hallway, checking rooms, and making sure everything was locked up for the night. But the feeling of being watched never left. It was like the walls themselves were observing me, waiting for me to slip up, to make the wrong move. I didn't realize how much time had passed until I checked the clock on the wall near the elevator. It was nearly 3:30 a.m. I was supposed to finish my rounds in the next hour, but something tugged at me, something I couldn't ignore. There was a strange pull toward the old wing of the hospital. It was one of the parts that had been there the longest, before the expansion, before the renovation. The walls still bore the faint yellow stain of age, the kind you couldn't scrub away. The rooms here were rarely used, and when they were, it was usually for overflow or quarantine. The air always felt heavier in that part of the hospital. Tonight, though, something felt different. I knew I shouldn't go, but I couldn't help myself. My feet moved before my brain could catch up, taking me down the dim corridor. I passed the old janitor's closet on the left, its door slightly ajar. I paused, unsure of what I was seeing. The flickering light from above cast strange shadows in the room, and there, just inside the door, I saw a reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. At first, I thought it was just me, my own tired eyes staring back, a trick of the light. But then I noticed something else. Behind me in the reflection, there was a figure. It wasn't clear, like someone standing just out of view, but I could make out the outline. Thin, tall, the kind of silhouette that made your skin prickle. My heart raced, and I stepped backward, my foot catching on the edge of a discarded mop bucket. The loud clatter echoed down the hall, but the figure didn't flinch. It didn't move. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway was empty. No one. Just me. I stared at the janitor's closet for a few long seconds, my mind struggling to make sense of what I'd seen. I wasn't sure if it had been my imagination playing tricks on me, or if something else was happening here, something I wasn't meant to see. I took a deep breath and started to move away, but my gaze lingered on the mirror once more. And that's when I saw it. The reflection of the figure was still there, only it wasn't behind me anymore. It was now standing just to the left, closer, as if it had taken a step forward. I froze. It wasn't my reflection. It was something else. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. I had to get out of that hallway. I spun around and fled, my footsteps echoing loudly in the emptiness. My heart pounded in my chest, the only sound that filled the silence. I didn't look back, not even once, but I could feel it, a pull, a pressure on my back, like someone or something was following me. I wasn't sure where I was running to. It didn't matter. I just needed to get away. I stumbled into the staff break room, gasping for air. My pulse was erratic, my hands clammy. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, standing just beyond the mirror, its presence so unnatural. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. What was happening? What was I seeing? I sat down on one of the chairs, leaning forward with my head in my hands. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only noise in the room. I tried to calm myself, focus on the rational thoughts that had always gotten me through situations like this. But it wasn't working. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the reflection. The figure in the mirror wasn't real. It couldn't be. I'd seen enough strange things in my life to know that the mind could play tricks, but something about tonight felt different. It wasn't just my mind. It felt like something else had shifted. Something had moved within the walls of this place, and I had no idea how to stop it. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 4 a.m. now. I still had an hour left before my shift ended, but I didn't want to go back out there, not with that thing still lurking somewhere in the hospital. But what choice did I have? I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. I had to finish my rounds. It was what I was here for. As I stepped back into the hallway, the hospital felt even colder than before. The silence was thick, oppressive. It wasn't just the stillness of an empty building, it was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being suffocated. I made my way down the hallway, but this time, I didn't look at the janitor's closet. I didn't want to. I couldn't. But as I reached the end of the hall, something caught my eye. A figure. just at the corner of my vision. I didn't need to look again to know who it was. The figure from the reflection was standing there, watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't the usual unease I felt at night. It wasn't the quiet hum of the hospital or the strange noises that sometimes echoed through the empty halls. This felt deeper, like the very foundation of the building had shifted, like something was waiting for me. The clock read 4:30 a.m. as I stood in the hallway, staring at the spot where the figure had been. But now there was nothing. The hall was empty, like it always was at this hour. The lights flickered above me, casting long, stretched shadows across the walls. It was the same building, the same hospital, but it felt different now. I was used to working the night shift, used to the isolation, the cold emptiness, but tonight felt wrong. It was as if the walls were closing in on me. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating. I couldn't explain it, but every step I took seemed to make the tension worse. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It had intensified. I walked faster, my footsteps echoing in the silence, desperate to finish my rounds. I passed the rooms, checking the doors, making sure they were locked. I moved like a machine, barely thinking, just going through the motions. But I couldn't ignore the sense of dread creeping up my spine. I turned the corner and nearly ran into a nurse. She was young, early 20s, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. I had seen her around before, but we'd never really spoken. Her name was Jenna, I think. She worked the late shifts in the ICU. "You okay?" I asked, surprised at the concern in my own voice. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared at me, like she was lost in thought, her eyes distant. Her lips moved as though she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Finally, she blinked, as if snapping out of a trance. Yeah, just tired," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder. I followed her gaze, but there was nothing there. I looked back at her, and for a moment, I could have sworn there was fear in her eyes. "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." She gave a weak laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I haven't seen anything. It's just this place. It gets to you, you know." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed her. There was something more going on here, something deeper than exhaustion or the usual stress of the job. Before I could ask anything else, she turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, as if I had just missed something. I shook it off. It didn't matter. I had to finish my rounds. I continued down the hallway, but my mind was elsewhere. What had she seen? What had she been looking at? I had to admit, the fear in her eyes had unnerved me. And the fact that she hadn't been willing to talk about it, had barely been able to speak at all, told me there was more to this hospital than I had realized. I reached the old wing again. It wasn't on my list for the night, but something was pulling me back. Maybe it was my curiosity, or maybe it was the feeling that something was waiting for me there, something that needed to be uncovered. I stood in front of the door to room 213, the one I had heard strange noises from before. I hadn't checked it earlier, but now I felt like I had no choice. The door creaked open slowly, the air inside stale and heavy. The lights flickered for a moment, casting strange shadows across the room. I stepped inside, my boots squeaking against the worn linoleum floor. The bed was empty, the sheets neatly folded. The room looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but something about it felt wrong. I glanced around, my eyes moving to the small window across the room. The blinds were half closed, but the faint glow of the moonlight filtered through, casting an eerie glow across the room. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, there was a shadow. It was like the darkness had gathered there, more solid than the rest of the room. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was too dark, too dense. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped forward, my pulse racing. "Hello," I whispered, though I didn't know why. The room felt alive, like something was watching me, waiting. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. I moved closer to the shadow, my legs trembling beneath me. My hand reached out, but before I could touch it, something shifted. The air grew colder, and the shadow seemed to ripple, like it was alive, like it was moving. I pulled my hand back quickly, stepping away from the corner. The shadow seemed to follow me, stretching out, filling the room with an unnatural presence. "Get out," I heard a voice, low and guttural, echoing in my mind. I froze. The voice wasn't in the room, not physically, but I could hear it inside my head, clearer than anything else. It was a warning, a command. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow as I stumbled down the hallway. I didn't stop until I was back in the break room, where I slumped into a chair, gasping for air. What the hell was happening? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't ignore this anymore. Whatever was haunting this hospital, whatever was lurking in the shadows, it wasn't going to let me go. I had to find out what it wanted. The night dragged on, but time felt warped, stretched out of shape. I found myself staring at the clock in the break room, but the minutes seemed to blur into each other, like I was caught in a loop. I hadn't expected things to get this strange, this fast. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in deeper than I had ever realized. I hadn't told anyone what had happened in room 213. Jenna's face flashed in my mind again, her eyes wide with fear. I thought about going to her, about telling her what I'd seen, what I'd heard. But I couldn't. She was already in too deep herself. The hospital was a place where secrets festered, where no one really talked about what went on after hours. You just kept your head down, did your job, and survived. But survival was becoming more difficult. The darkness seemed to be pressing in from all sides. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was watching me, something that had been there long before I ever stepped foot in the hospital. I had felt it since my first night, those strange noises, the whispers that seemed to follow me, but now it was more than just a feeling. It was real. The shadows in the halls, the cold that never quite left, they weren't figments of my imagination. They were something else, something far older, far darker. I wasn't sure how long I sat there in the break room, staring at the walls, when the sudden sound of footsteps snapped me out of my daze. It was the heavy, purposeful sound of boots on the linoleum, the kind that only someone who knew this building well would make. I stood up, my body on alert, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. The door opened slowly, and I froze. It was the janitor from the night shift, old Jerry. He was a relic of the hospital, a man who had been working there longer than anyone could remember. He'd always been a quiet guy, the kind of person who kept to himself and never said much about anything. But tonight, something about him seemed different. He stood in the doorway, his expression blank, his eyes unfocused. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, his gaze hollow. Then, without a word, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Jerry," I said, my voice tight. "What's going on? You need something?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, in the middle of the room, his hands at his sides. His clothes were stained with something dark, something that didn't look like cleaning supplies. I could smell the faint odor of something foul, something decayed. "Jerry," I repeated, stepping forward, but he didn't move. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the glass cabinet behind him, something moved. It wasn't Jerry, but something else, something standing just behind him, just out of sight. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, staring right at me through the reflection. My heart skipped a beat, and I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. "Jerry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't react. He just stood there, motionless, as if he hadn't heard me at all. The figure behind him grew clearer in the reflection, its body jerking as if it was caught between realities, flickering in and out of existence. I could see its eyes now, if you could call them eyes. They were hollow pits, dark and endless, like the void itself. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself, but my legs felt like they were going to give out beneath me. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, caught in the web of whatever this was. I took another step back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But before I could act, the figure in the reflection moved. It wasn't just a shift or a flicker. It lunged. I screamed, stumbling backward, but the figure didn't move in the reflection, it moved in the real world. Jerry's body jerked, his head snapping to the side as if pulled by an invisible force. His mouth opened wide in a silent scream, but no sound came out. The lights above us flickered, and the room seemed to distort, the walls bending inward as the air thickened with a suffocating weight. I had to leave. I didn't look back as I bolted out of the break room, my heart hammering in my chest. My feet pounded down the hallway, the sound echoing in the empty halls. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from that room, away from Jerry, away from whatever was in there with him. As I turned the corner, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps following me. Slow, deliberate. Not the quick, panicked steps of someone running, but a steady, measured pace. Someone or something was coming after me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my breath ragged, my legs burning. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to escape. But I could hear it getting closer, the sound of boots scraping against the floor, echoing in the darkness. When I reached the stairwell, I threw open the door and slammed it behind me. I leaned against it, gasping for air, trying to gather my bearings. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what I had just witnessed, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe here. Not anymore. The hospital had always been a place of sterile order, a world where everything had its place, its purpose. But now it felt like the walls were closing in. The lights flickered overhead as I stood in the stairwell, my back pressed against the door, trying to calm my racing heart. I couldn't explain what had happened with Jerry, or why the halls felt so suffocating now. But something had changed, something that had been buried in this building for years, maybe even decades. I wasn't sure how much longer I could ignore it. I glanced up at the emergency exit sign above me, the dim red glow cutting through the darkness. It was a cruel reminder of the reality I was facing. This place wasn't just a job, it was a trap. I pushed myself off the door and started down the stairs. I didn't know where I was going anymore, just that I couldn't stay where I was. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, but as I made my way through the hallways, the silence seemed to press in on me, thick and oppressive. No one else was here. No other night staff. No patients. No doctors. The building had swallowed them up, just like it had swallowed me. I reached the main floor, the sound of my footsteps the only thing that broke the silence. I was so tired. My body ached. My mind felt like it was spinning. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was going on. That's when I saw her again. Jenna was standing at the end of the hall, just beyond the swing doors that led to the morgue. She was staring at me, her face pale, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear, but something more too. Something that went beyond simple anxiety. "Jenna," I called out, my voice hoarse. She didn't respond. She just stood there, as if waiting for something. I took a step toward her, but before I could reach her, she turned and disappeared behind the doors. "No," I muttered, my stomach sinking. "No, not again." I followed her, my feet moving faster than I wanted them to. As I pushed through the swing doors, the temperature seemed to drop. It felt like I was walking into a freezer. The smell of antiseptic and decay hit me hard, a sharp metallic stench that made my stomach churn. But it wasn't the smell that stopped me. It was the sight. Jenna was standing in front of one of the morgue drawers, her back to me. She was facing the cold metal, her hands pressed flat against it, as if trying to hold it closed. But the drawer was already open. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, a cold sweat creeping over me. "Jenna," I said again, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't turn around. She didn't move. But I saw her hands white, trembling, gripping the sides of the drawer. And as I stepped closer, I saw it too. The body inside the drawer wasn't just a body. It was shifting. The form was too fluid, too unnatural. It was twisting in a way that didn't make sense, like a reflection warping in a broken mirror. And then it hit me. The thing in the drawer wasn't dead. Not entirely. "Jenna, get away from it." I shouted, but she didn't respond. I reached for her arm, but as I touched her, I felt the pull, something cold and slick, like a vacuum, pulling at my insides. The drawer opened wider, and the figure inside lunged. It wasn't human anymore, not in the way we understood. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to pull everything around them into them. I watched, paralyzed, as the figure's hands shot out, claws that scraped across the metal with a screech. And then it was on her. "No," I screamed, grabbing for Jenna, trying to pull her away, but it was too late. I saw her face, her mouth open in a silent scream, as the creature, whatever it was, dragged her into the drawer with it. There was no blood, no gore. Just the sickening sense that something ancient had claimed her. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, my legs weak. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. This place wasn't just haunted by the dead. It was haunted by something worse, something that had never left. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and ran, pushing through the doors, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to get out. I had to leave. But the hospital wasn't done with me. I could hear it behind me, the footsteps, slow but steady, echoing through the hallways. It was following me, chasing me, like it had chased everyone else who had worked here. I made it to the exit, to the front doors. They wouldn't open. I pulled at the handle, frantic now, but they wouldn't budge. I turned to look behind me, but the hall was empty. I ran back to the stairwell, my mind numb, my body exhausted. I had to get out of here. I had to leave this place behind. But as I turned the corner, I heard it again, the footsteps, getting closer. And I realized then, in the pit of my stomach, that I wasn't running from something. I was running toward it, and it had been waiting for me the whole time.